When you think about major global economic partnerships, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, well, it's a relationship with some really big numbers often thrown around.
Absolutely. And sometimes those numbers, they paint a picture that's maybe not quite aligned with the full reality. There's a lot of complexity there.
Definitely. And that's what we're here to unpack in this deep dive. We've looked at some recent analysis, some historical data, all focusing on that U.S.-Saudi trade and investment picture.
Yeah, the goal really is to sift through the headlines, to look at the data on goods, services, investment flows, asset holdings.
And figure out what's solid and what might be, let's say, aspirational. So for you listening, we want to give you that clear, data-backed perspective.
Exactly. Distinguish the facts from maybe the slightly inflated claims.
Okay, so let's start with maybe the most talked about claim from a few years back. During the last Trump administration, there was this figure, $450 billion, that Saudi Arabia supposedly agreed to spend on U.S. products.
Right. That number got a lot of attention. A huge figure.
Huge. But what does the actual data say?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. If you look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, their numbers show that over the past 25 years, combined,
Yep.
the U.S. exported about $455 billion in goods and services to Saudi Arabia, total.
Wait, so $455 billion over 25 years, and the claim was $450 billion in just a few years.
Precisely. So that one headline figure was nearly the sum total of a quarter century of actual trade. Yeah. It just doesn't quite match the long-term reality of U.S. exports to the kingdom.
Okay, so let's zoom in on those specific years then, 2017 to 2020. What were the actual export numbers?
During that 4-year period, U.S. exports goods and services to Saudi Arabia totaled around $92 billion.
$92 billion. I mean, still a lot of money, but...
But significantly less than $450 billion.
Right.
And what's more, it was actually lower than the $110 billion the U.S. exported during Obama's second term, the preceding 4 years.
Lower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even if you, say, exclude 2020 because of the pandemic's impact on trade,
Right.
the annual average for 2017-2019 was still almost $4 billion less per year than the average under Obama. And it's not just U.S. data saying this. Saudi Arabia's own statistical agency shows a similar trend for goods trade.
So the idea of that massive $450 billion spending spree on goods and services, it didn't happen based on the trade figures.
All right.
But what about other things? Could financial assets like investments be part of that $450 billion number somehow?
That's a fair question. People sometimes conflate different flows. So let's look at assets. Between late 2016 and late 2020, Saudi Arabia's total foreign assets did increase by about $200 billion globally.
Okay, $200 billion increase.
Now, and it's a big if all of that increase went into U.S. assets, which is pretty unlikely.
Why unlikely?
Well, U.S. Treasury data for that same period suggests Saudi holdings of U.S. stocks and bonds increased by more like $130 billion, not $200 billion.
Oh, okay.
So even if you take that $130 billion, maybe a bit more for other assets, and add it to the $92 billion in goods and services exports, you're still well under $300 billion.
Ooh, nowhere near $450 billion.
Not even close. So the key takeaway here is clear. That huge $450 billion figure for goods and services just wasn't borne out by the data.
Okay, that's a really important clarification. Let's shift gears then. What about money flowing the other way? Saudi investment into the United States. There was another big number mentioned recently, wasn't there?
Yes. The Saudi finance minister mentioned more than $770 billion of investments in the United States. Another very substantial figure.
$770 billion. Okay, how does that stack up? Is that plausible?
Well, context is key here. Saudi Arabia's total foreign assets globally were estimated around $1.5 trillion towards the end of last year, Q3 2024.
So $1.5 trillion total. $770 billion in the U.S. would be...
Like half.
Roughly half, yeah. Which, given the strong ties, the dollar peg for the oil being priced in dollars, it's not impossible that they hold such a large share in the U.S., but it's very difficult to confirm that $770 billion figure using publicly available data. The way these things are tracked, it's often opaque. So what can we verify? What do the public data points suggest?
Okay, if we piece together the available information, we get to a figure closer to maybe $490 billion.
$490 billion. So quite a gap from $770 billion. How do you arrive at that number?
All right, let's break it down. First, U.S. Treasury data. They track identified portfolio holdings, think long-term securities like treasuries, corporate bonds, stocks. As of Q3 2024, identified Saudi holdings were about $350 billion.
$350 billion identified, but you mentioned opacity. What's missing?
Well, a lot of international investment flows through offshore financial centers,
Mhm.
places like Bermuda, Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Ireland.
Right, makes it harder to track the ultimate owner.
Exactly. About a quarter of all foreign holdings of U.S. portfolio securities are held through these kinds of centers. So it's very likely Saudi Arabia uses them too.
So how do you estimate their share?
It's tricky, obviously. But if we do a simple allocation, assume Saudi Arabia uses these centers proportionally to their identified holdings relative to the global total, that could add, very roughly, another $110 billion to their U.S. portfolio assets.
Okay, so $350 billion identified plus maybe $110 billion through offshore centers. That gets us to $460 billion. What else?
Then you have data from the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS. They show U.S. banks had liabilities to Saudi residents of nearly $24 billion. Think deposits, basically.
Right, add another $24 billion.
And finally, foreign direct investment, FDI. This is like building factories or buying controlling stakes in companies. The Bureau of Economic Analysis data puts Saudi FDI in the U.S. at about $9.5 billion at the end of 2023.
So 350 plus $110 is $460, plus $24 is $484, plus about $10 billion.
Yeah,
Around $490 billion.
exactly. So the takeaway on investment, while $770 billion figure isn't theoretically impossible depending on definitions, the publicly verifiable data points towards something closer to $490 billion.
That makes sense. A possible figure versus a verifiable one. Okay, let's look forward now. There's been talk about increasing trade and investment. The Saudi crown prince mentioned a goal of, what, $600 billion over the next 4 years?
Yes, another very large, very ambitious number, $600 billion in additional trade and investment with the U.S. over the next 4 years.
Wow, let's put that in perspective. $600 billion over 4 years is $150 billion a year on average?
Correct, $150 billion annually. Now think about what that means for Saudi Arabia. That amount is roughly 14% of their entire annual GDP.
14% of GDP.
It's about 40% of their total annual export revenues. And it's more than half of what they currently import in goods and services each year from the entire world.
Okay, framing it like that really highlights the scale. That's huge. How much do they import from the U.S. right now?
Currently, about 9% of Saudi Arabia's goods imports come from the U.S. Just for comparison, China supplied about 23% of their goods imports so far this year.
Only 9% from the U.S. So to hit that $600 billion target, a lot would have to come from increased U.S. exports, right? Is that realistic?
Well, U.S. exports will likely grow. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 involves massive economic diversification, modernizing their military. There are definitely opportunities for U.S. companies in defense, tech, construction, finance, tourism, health, education.
There are lots of sectors.
But even with, say, an optimistic growth rate of 10% per year for U.S. exports over the next 4 years.
There's a pretty strong growth.
Yeah, even then, the total cumulative exports would only be around $125 billion over those 4 years.
Yeah.
Maybe some big multi-year contracts could boost that, but fundamentally,
It doesn't get you anywhere near the $600 billion.
not even close. That leaves a massive gap, like $475 billion that would need to come from new investments from Saudi Arabia into the U.S.
$475 billion in new investment over 4 years, on top of existing levels.
Exactly. Now, investment will likely grow, sure. They want technology, skills, diversification. But that scale, $475 billion, seems highly improbable.
Why improbable? What are the constraints?
Well, a big one is the overall economic picture. The IMF is actually projecting that Saudi Arabia might run current account deficits between 2025 and 2028.
Deficits, meaning they'd be spending more internationally than they're earning.
Basically, yes. If those projections hold, they simply won't have large new surpluses accumulating that they can easily deploy as fresh investments abroad.
So if they don't have new surpluses, where would that massive $475 billion in new U.S. investment possibly come from?
It would have to come from somewhere else. Either they'd need to reallocate their existing foreign assets, sell investments elsewhere to buy more in the U.S.
On a huge scale.
On a massive scale. To hit that number mainly through reallocation, you'd be talking about potentially having over 80% of their total foreign assets parked in the U.S. That's a very high concentration.
Seems unlikely. What's the alternative?
The other way is to increase their liabilities. Either take on significant new debt or maybe sell off some domestic assets to foreign investors to raise funds. Again, possible to some extent, but likely not on the scale needed to generate $475 billion for U.S. investment.
Okay, so the takeaway on the future commitment, that $600 billion looks very, very optimistic. highly unlikely to be achieved given current trends and projections.
That seems to be the most realistic assessment based on the numbers, yes.
Now, stepping back a bit, how does this idea of potentially huge increases in U.S. trade investment fit with Saudi Arabia's own big domestic plan, Vision 2030?
That's a really important question. Vision 2030, especially through their Public Investment Fund, the PIF, has increasingly focused on domestic investment, building new industries, creating jobs, diversifying the economy at home.
Right, so pouring potentially hundreds of billions more into the U.S. seems potentially counter to that domestic focus.
It creates a tension, certainly. There's a finite amount of capital. Plus, you have the factor of oil revenues. They aren't as high as their recent peaks.
Making it harder to fund everything.
Exactly. Funding the ambitious domestic goals of Vision 2030 and potentially making massive new commitments abroad becomes much more challenging with lower oil income.
And isn't there also pressure from the U.S. side regarding oil prices?
Yes, that adds another layer. If the U.S. administration is asking Saudi Arabia and OPEC to, say, keep oil prices lower or even push them down,
That further reduces the very revenue they need for both domestic spending and foreign investment.
precisely. So the Saudi authorities are really in a tough spot. They need to balance their crucial domestic transformation agenda with keeping the relationship with the U.S. administration, let's say, on side. It's a delicate balancing act.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main message you want listeners to take away about this whole U.S.-Saudi economic picture?
I think the core point is this. The economic and financial links are definitely significant. They are important. But those really, really large numbers you often hear bandied about.
The $450 billion, the $770 billion, the $600 billion.
Yeah, those figures often seem to be either significant exaggerations of what actually happened in the past, or they represent extremely optimistic, maybe unrealistic projections for the future. The verifiable data often tells a more modest story.
Right. So for you listening, hopefully you now have a clearer, more grounded understanding of this key relationship beyond just the headline numbers.
That's the goal.
And to leave you with something to mull over, considering those IMF projections about potential Saudi current account deficits and their very strong domestic investment push with Vision 2030, what might the long-term implications be for the actual nature and the overall scale of Saudi investment in the U.S. down the road? Something to think about.